welcome you all here on behalf of the Traditional Britain Group. We are now getting a bit long in the tooth. We've been operational since 2001 when we replaced the old Western Girls Institute. That's not Western Girls Institute, it's Western Goals. So we've got a good lineup for you today. The first person that I'm going to invite to address you is David Clews. And David is the lead correspondent for the Unity News Network. He's got over 20 years of political and campaigning experience and a wealth of social media and communication skills. He gets to the heart of what is or should be important to the people of the United Kingdom. So, David.
Thank you, Gregory. Thank you. Gregory, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I thought it was very praiseworthy, and then I remembered I actually wrote that about myself. So, ladies and gentlemen, just while we start, I've got some good news, but I've also got some bad news. What do you want? Do you want the good news first or the bad news? Right, well, I'll give you the good news first. No, I won't. I'll give you the bad news. The bad news is that the country's knackered, right? It's in a very bad situation. I'd give it 20 years. The good news is that looking at some of you in the audience, you're not going to have to see it, so... I digress. You know what? I'm very impressed. It's actually a very young audience, which is very pleasing. And I have to say in general that with politics, there has been over the last year or two what I would call a rebirth in politics, that young people are starting to get involved, because for years young people just weren't caring. And I think young people look at what has been handed to them, the legacy that they've been given, you know, one where you cannot afford a house, people are terrified to start a family, and they think, well, what have we got to lose? So I think that's very, very encouraging. I'll tell you a bit about myself and my background, and then I'm going to talk a wee bit about Scotland, what's going on up there, and then the UK in general, and maybe some more global things, and what I think needs to be done moving forward. So as Gregory said, I've always been interested in politics. I was slightly right of centre as a teenager. I think it's fair to say as people are, but then thought, well, I'll join the Conservative Party. So I joined the Tory Party in about 2005 and campaigned there. And then in 2007, I was actually elected as a Tory councillor. And it's quite interesting when I look back on it, because I think to myself, imagine allowing like a 24-year-old wet behind the ears to be involved in politics in the country. But I think even then I had a sense that I didn't know everything. Whereas if you look at a lot of the young politicians coming through, they are know-it-alls. And I was involved with the Tory party for 3 years. And I have to say, never in my life have I come across such duplicitous, self-serving liars than I have in the Tory party. It was that this was 17 years ago now. These were just absolutely horrific people. They only cared about themselves. They only cared about their career. They had no interest whatsoever in people or their concerns. And that was just at a Scottish level. And things were better 17 years ago. And I remember at the time, a young Ruth Davidson, I'm sure many of you know, she's now Baroness Davidson, and she's a mother with her wife, which is an interesting combination. She was a bag handler at the time. She came on board and worked as a secretary for Annabel Goldie, who was the then leader. And you saw the way in which these people, because she was able to actually string a few words together, they just promoted her, and then she gave her a candidate. And then before you knew it, she was the leader of the Scottish Tories. But she was absolutely talentless, and she literally, she had nothing behind her. There was nothing. And I'll tell you, it's a true story. I spoke to her at the time when I was a councillor, and I said that Linwood, which was an area I represented, Many of you will know Linwood, which was the home of the Roots car factory, industrial strife, but there was some regeneration. And I actually said, look, wouldn't it be good to get David Cameron to come to somewhere like Linwood, to get him to see an area that maybe wasn't traditionally conservative, but voted conservative? And she just said, well, I don't think David would come to Linwood. That's what she actually said. And I just thought at the time, these people have ended. So in my fit of anger and just hatred of the Tory party, I crossed the floor, so to speak, and joined the Labour Party, which, again, quite interestingly, even 14 years ago, the Labour Party were not anything like the modern Labour Party. And, you know, I'm not a socialist. I don't agree with socialism at all. But one thing I would say, the stark difference was that most of the people who were either Labour politicians or councillors, they did actually kind of care. They cared about the local area and they did want something better. But even then, they were a busted flush. But my politics back then was much more driven by the constitutional question. I've always been a big supporter of the United Kingdom. So, like a lot of people, you would think, well, I will vote anything to stop the SNP. I will do anything to keep the United Kingdom intact. And there was a lot of pragmatism that went on. And still to this day in Scotland, the constitutional question does dominate Scottish politics. And it was interesting then at the last election, because so many people were voting Labour because they wanted the SNP out in Scotland. And I don't vote anymore. I think the whole thing's a joke, but it's up to you what you decide to do. I was saying to people, if I was voting, and I know this might be a controversial statement, I would have voted SNP to stop the Labour Party, because in my opinion, Labour under Starmer is the sum of all evils. And and a slightly woke, annoying SNP is nothing compared to the carnage that has been inflicted by Sir Keir and his crowd. So in terms of Scotland, do many of you travel up to Scotland? Any of you from Scotland? I know one man is. Anyone else? Yourself? Anyone got any family that are from Scotland originally? Yeah. So there's such a rich history between Scotland. Scotland at the moment is, let's be honest, it's pretty grim. It's pretty grim. If you go out with the big cities, but even if you go into Glasgow is really, it's actually sad to see. Glasgow was, of course, the second city of the empire, a thriving metropolis. And I read the other day that rats are now at record levels in Glasgow. And just the dirt overall, the litter, you can see it. Because when you travel down to London, as much as London has its issues, you can clearly see that London has significant wealth and significant investment and development. You just don't have that up in Glasgow, and Edinburgh is a very thriving place. But it's just there's an emptiness now, I think it's fair to say, about Scotland, a nothingness, where you have this political class that runs the show. And that also even applies to people who are supporters of the SNP, like people who I would say are genuine believers in Scottish independence. Because what have you got? A party that supports continued membership of NATO, a party that supports continued membership of the European Union, a party that supports all the woke policies. And there has been a big split within the SNP in terms of people who they've had enough of the woke agenda. And they see the way in which the political class it doesn't represent them. And it is this sort of cancer of politics exists everywhere in the Western world, and Scotland is another prime example of that, where you take basically talentless individuals who are useless in the real world, and you then give them a well-paid job in the city centre, you give them an office, you give them a secretary, and they will not do anything to rock the boat. I mean, can anybody even think of anyone in a political party who is considered a rebel these days? I grew up in the 80s, well, later 80s, and I remember left and right, there were people that diverged from their party, or there were people that were somewhat different. It doesn't exist. There is no characters. And say what you want again about Salmond. Salmond was the real last, I would say, politician in Scotland. He commanded a room. I mean, Alex Salmond could have come here today and made a speech and you probably wouldn't have chased him out. Salmond was capable of speaking to business. Salmond was capable of speaking to all types of people. But then Sturgeon as well, I mean, just just a disastrous figure in Scottish politics. And a lot of people are quite pleased to see her demise. But I have been known for being somewhat conspiratorial and continue to be. I do think there has been a concerted attempt to destroy the SNP because Labour needed those 35, 40 seats up in Scotland. And this investigation that's taking place into Sturgeon and her husband, I mean, I think they've clearly done some things that are wrong, but is it criminal? Is it anything relative to what happened during the COVID scandal with the PPE contracts? So I think the SNP have been kind of shafted by the Labour establishment. And that Labour establishment does exist up in Scotland as well. Because the regime, the British regime that I think runs this country, it fears any change. It fears anything. And what I was talking to someone earlier, and I say is, I think people need to look past this left-right divide and realise that when anyone is shaking the foundations of the state, when anyone is disturbing the force, so to speak, I just think we should be supporting that. And that doesn't mean we all start, dyeing our hair blue and join Extinction Rebellion, who I don't really think are opposition either. But the British state is in a very fragile position just now. And the regime, the people that run this country they are really, 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 really struggling. So just in terms of Scotland, the future I see for Scotland, it is grim, I'm afraid. You've got Ineos, which is the oil refinery in Grangemouth, a beacon of industry, and that's closing. They say 400 jobs, I would say it's more like 1,000, and you'll have thousands more jobs directly, just like Port Talbot down in Wales. And again, these are jobs that would have been traditionally male orientated. They were working men, they were hard working, and that's gone. They've absolutely decimated the oil and gas industry up in Aberdeen. If anyone's been up to Aberdeen, I remember going to Aberdeen 10 years ago and it was booming. Porsches, Ferraris, and everyone had a job. They've killed it. You're looking at negative equity in a lot of homes. And that's to do with also the SNP and the Labour Party and net zero. But see, again, this is the point I'm trying to make. With the SNP will talk a woke game. They'll say, well, we need to stop oil and gas, blah, blah, blah. But they'll realise they can't alienate their core vote. They will realise they can't, lose these people their jobs. Whereas someone like Ed Miliband's just come in, and Ed Miliband is, right, everything's shutting down. And it's a wasteland up in Scotland. What does Scotland still have going for it? It's got amazing scenery, not so good weather. It's got a brilliant whiskey industry, golf, tourism. So there will always be a thriving Scotland. But as a nation, the nation that did so much for the world, so many Scots and people as part of the UK, John Logie Baird, Alexander Fleming, all these amazing figures, James Watt, so many modern inventions. There was an incredible statistic that in the 1800s there was more per capita billionaires in Glasgow than there are in modern day Moscow. But they've really, really lost their way up in Scotland, and I'm not really sure what the answer for it might be. There is an argument, and that's not one that I support, but independence would be the answer. Just a cold, hard shock to the system. But I don't think that would work. Again, my big argument against that is you would end up being swallowed by the likes of BlackRock, Vanguard, International Capital. They would just come in and they would obliterate you. But if someone was to say, look, we're going to be an independent nation, we're going to take back control, heard that before, we're going to do all these things, but they're not selling that. They're selling some form of administrative control. So if anyone wants to ask me any questions after about Scotland, happy to answer that. So I want to move on then to the UK situation, the first 100 days of power with Starmer. And someone groaning already. I was warning people about Starmer. I thought he was a very dangerous figure. I thought there was just something not right about him when he constantly would go on and talk about his father being a toolmaker. which was his only thing that he could say. But I don't think anybody was really prepared for who he was and exactly what he represents. And what he has done in this 100 days, it's mind-blowing. It really is. He's managed to alienate everybody, which is incredible. Because Starmer really represents everything that is the worst of this country. He has no morals. He's got no faith. Now, I'm not saying everyone has to be a Christian, but this was a Christian country with Christian thoughts, and he's proudly declared that he's an atheist, yet he decides to bring up his children in another tradition. But he is proud of his atheism that he then sells to everyone else. He is I think he is a social climber. He loves being a sir. He loves the trappings of power. And he is fundamentally someone that is very easy to buy off. And you've seen the way in which he has basically prostituted himself to the likes of Lord Ali, to others as well. And I think for most people, the notion that these people were elected on a platform to say, we're going to clean up politics, the adults are back in the room, and they're all taking tickets to go and see Taylor Swift. In many ways, this is good, though, because the Tory party is dead, and hopefully will continue to die a slow death. This may see the end of the Labour Party, which really needs to happen, because they are part of the same regime. And it's on the big issues. They all agree on everything. They are all massively pro-war. Both the Tories and Labour both support the war in Ukraine, which again people have strong opinions on, but nobody's doing anything to try and stop. They fully support what is going on in Gaza and the Middle East. They fully support additional funding for militaries that aren't anything to do with us. They support mass demographic replacement in this country. They support mass immigration. There's nothing between them. They are all traitors in what they have done. But what has happened specifically, it really upsets me, is what they have done to the people that were involved in the disorder and the way in which they portrayed what happened. Now, I'm not a violent person. I don't go out and attack police, and I don't think people should either. However, the lie that they put out was that the disorder was thugs, and it was the organised far right, and it was the English Defence League. And we were pointing out the English Defence League hadn't existed for 10 years. What happened after that was there was a terrible killings in Southport, and anger that had been boiling over for decades. Not just a few weeks, decades, erupted onto the streets. And yes, there was a lot of bad actors involved. Yes, there was a lot of people pushing it. But most people that went out were venting their anger. And what was it? People always like to quote Martin Luther King in these situations, don't they? A riot is the language of the unheard. Yet this time these people were the scummiest fascist people possible. And what Starmer did, which was really, really, really so wrong, was he fanned the flames of those riots. Though that could have been stopped on the Thursday morning, when Starmer could have come out and he could have said very simply, look, we understand people are hurting. We understand that people are sad at what's happened. but we can't have you going out and attacking the police. We can't have violence on the streets. So we ask you to come out and trust us. He didn't. He came out and basically was like Hope Not Hate or some other leftist organisation, the Socialist Workers' Party. The far right, the racists are on the march. And he fanned the flames. And they antagonised people. And again, it never happened in a microcosm. You had the Hare Hills riot, which was Roma gypsies, and they set the place on fire and nobody said a word about it. And then you'd had the Manchester airport incident where a policewoman was clearly battered in the face and the guy that did it is still out on bail. And people are looking at this thinking, how is any of this fair? And then what's happened since the disorder, what they have done to these people is beyond really evil. These are everyday people who maybe did some stupid things. They could have had community sentences, they could have had rehabilitation orders, they could have been put on probation. Instead, what they did was they went to their house. I mean, you had Mark Rowley, the superintendent of the Metropolitan Police, going to people's doors and knocking them up and taking them out in front of the cameras, humiliating them. I argue that they basically kidnapped these people. The state went with their police authorities and they kidnapped them. They took them in and said, right, if you don't plead guilty, you're going to wait a year, we're going to not give you bail, and you're going to face 5 years in prison. For comments on social media. I mean, it is despicable. And right now you've got people, and you can't deny people bail. When you see the people that get bail, and you cannot deny them their rights. But they did. They denied these people their rights. They gave them duty solicitors who really just weren't fussed. And now many of them have pled guilty and they're rotting in prison cells. There was one guy in particular who ran a Twitter account called Sick of It, Wayne GB, just like an everyday guy who's had enough. This guy's doing 2.5 years in prison for tweets. 2.5 years. And he was a carer to his wife. But what they did was they took him in and then he pled guilty. Whereas, he might have had a chance. So I think what they did to these people really is a wake-up call to all of us. That if that's what they're prepared to do, they're prepared to do it to all of us. They're prepared to call every one of us here a racist, hate-filled fascist. And as they say, what do you do with these? You can't debate with these people. You have to deal with them. And that's, again, my point is, with Starmer, it is the worst of all worlds. You have that extreme Socialist Workers' Party mentality merged with support for international capital, with support for all the wars. At least, and I'm not praising him, but at least under a Jeremy Corbyn government, you would have had some opposition to the military-industrial complex. You would have had some opposition to the selling off of the country, whereas with Starmer, it is the worst of all worlds. And I have said that I think everybody and everyone needs to be laser focused. We need to get Keir Starmer out of office as quickly as possible, because Starmer was their chosen boy. Starmer was the man that was going to come in, and he was Tony Blair Mark II. He was going to get things better, and he has failed. And if we can get Starmer out, if we can keep the pressure up on him, who's going to take over? Angela Rayner? Ursula Rayner? Is she gonna rock up with her jumpsuit on and take over? Some people say it would be Sadiq Khan. I don't think they would do that. First of all, he's not a member of Parliament just now. They could get him in. But I just think if we can get Starmer out, that would represent a huge victory. And it would also show that the country's ungovernable. Because look how many prime ministers we've had in the last 7 or 8 years. You have to get these people out. We have to, and I was talking about unmanageable. You've had Theresa May. You've had Boris Johnson. You've had Liz Truss. Rishi Sunak. Now Keir Starmer. If we can get rid of Starmer, that's 6 prime ministers in what, 7 or 8 years? How many companies can survive having one CEO, a different CEO every year? What you are doing is you are breaking down the fabric of it. You are showing people that this country is basically unmanageable. And I say to people here, because the people here from good backgrounds, etc., we need to take this country back, or else it's gone. It's finished. It's game over. And I would say we've got about 10 years to do it. And I know people have been saying that for quite a while. We've got 10 years, but that's all we really have this time. And if we don't, then we'll go the same way as South Africa, the same way as Rhodesia. We'll just become a failed state. And I don't want to live in a failed state. I want to live in a country that works for its people, and is a place where people can have a good, happy, free life, not this hell that we're now living in. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll take your questions.